Hello, my name is Ingrid. I'm with Central Rappahannock Regional Library, and I want to welcome everyone today to this afternoon's discussion on Forged in Freedom, the History of African American Craftspeople. This is part of the VA 250 series, and I am elated today to be joined by Dr. Gaila Sims. Dr. Sims, thank you for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm thrilled to be here, and I love talking about African American crafts. So thanks for having me.
Awesome. So for anyone that's watching that is not already familiar with you, would you tell them a little bit more about yourself and the work that you've been doing here in Fredericksburg?
Sure. So I am originally from Southern California. I'm from Riverside, California, an hour east of LA. Most people don't know where that is unless you're familiar with Southern California. But for the last 3 years, I've been living here in Fredericksburg, and I served as the inaugural curator of African American history and special projects at the Fredericksburg Area Museum. So that role entailed interpreting African American history both at the museum and for the whole city of Fredericksburg. I recently left my position, and this fall I will be teaching at Germanna Community College. I'll be teaching 2 courses on Intro to African American Studies. But generally, I'm a museum curator, a public historian, and very enthusiastic about sharing stories of African American people.
Oh, that's awesome. That is absolutely awesome. So before we jump into the discussion, I just wanted to mention that, of course, I'm nowhere near the level of history historical knowledge that you have. So we did some research, and I wanted to just sort of mention the books that we've looked at there. The first one is called Fighting for Freedom, Black Craftspeople and the Pursuit of Independence. And the second one, Hear Me Now, The Black Potters of Old Edgefield, South Carolina. All right, so let's just jump into the discussion. So as I was, kind of delving into the research, and I started looking at this book, Fighting for Freedom, there was a quote that sort of jumped out at me, and I remember just kind of lingering on it there. So I wanted to read it to you real quick and see what your thoughts are. It says, in the contemporary moment, there is a push to see that African American crafters are included in the canon of African American craft, and to argue for African American crafters to be acknowledged in their contributions to building the United States infrastructure and wealth. So in your role, are you seeing this sort of movement? I guess you could say, I don't know if that's the right word. Are you seeing that in your line of work? And if so, how so?
I have been seeing it more and more, especially at museums. I think a lot of museums are trying really hard to come up with new and innovative ways to interpret, especially African American history. I think for a long time there was a way that many museums interpreted, especially the period of enslavement. It leaned a lot on plantations and the kind of labor that went along with working on a big plantation, cotton or tobacco or sugar. But there's a lot of different ways that enslaved people lived and worked here in the United States. And so I think some museums are really committed to expanding our idea about what the lives of African American people look like. And I actually wanted to bring up an exhibition that I saw earlier this year. I was in Williamsburg for a conference. Shout out to the Lemon Project. So this is a symposium that William and Mary puts on every year. The Lemon Project is named after one of the men who was enslaved at William and Mary. His name was Lemon. And so in the spring, they do a symposium. They bring together all sorts of people who are doing work related, especially to African American history, but diverse histories generally. So I went this year and I spoke, and I had an amazing time. And one of the things I did while I was there was go to the art museum at Colonial Williamsburg, and they had a show called I Made This, the works of Black American artists and artisans. So the title, I Made This, comes from a quote from David Drake, who is a renowned potter. I know we'll be talking about him more in a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
The exhibition was really beautiful and brought together such an incredible assortment of people and objects and stories. And so I wanted to make sure I brought that up because I think if you're interested in kind of seeing more of this kind of work, especially pottery, quilts, things like that, there are museums that are committed to telling those stories. And also, in addition to kind of expanding our idea about what enslavement looked like, what this also does is help remind us collectively that Black people have been involved in almost every aspect of American life from the very beginning. The buildings that we walk through in Fredericksburg, some of those are quite old, and some of them were definitely made, or at least partially made, by enslaved workers. The pottery that we use every day to drink our coffee and things like that, it's unlikely that that was made by an enslaved laborer, but it's important to think about how in the early 19th century, it likely was. So, just as you're going around your day, think about how a lot of our modern day things that we're used to might have been influenced or might have been inspired by the work that enslaved people did here.
Wow, that's awesome. This is a great perspective too. Thank you for bringing that up. Absolutely. So you mentioned the pottery, and I wanted to delve into some of the craftspeople. And there was, as I was looking at this information, there's one figure that came up in both of the books, and he was discussed extensively, and that was Dave the Potter. And and rightfully so, he was one of the most skilled potters of the day. And I actually thought it was interesting too that he inscribed his work, which was a really big deal in his day. So can you talk about him a little bit?
Yeah, I would love to talk about David Drake. I think he is one of the most fascinating figures in American history. So I actually think I discovered him. I was in Atlanta and I was at the High Museum and I was with my sister, who's also a museum professional. And we were like, who is this? And then we started reading and we were obsessed. So David Drake, who's known as Dave the Potter, was African American. He lived in Edgefield, South Carolina, and he was enslaved. We believe he was born around 1800, although, as you probably know, it's difficult sometimes to know when enslaved people were born. Sometimes those records weren't kept. So he produced, specifically the work that he did was stoneware jugs. And they're beautiful. They're huge, they're like pretty hefty and beautifully made. And one of the reasons that he is so well known now is because, like you said, he inscribed his wares. So as most people know, most enslaved people were not permitted to learn how to read or write. It was in fact illegal in many places. And so the fact that, first of all, he knew enough to write on his creations is a pretty big deal. We don't know exactly how he learned to read or write, but we believe that he was taught by perhaps the person who enslaved him. Again, we're not positive about that. And it was actually punishable at that time for enslaved people to know how to read or write in the early 19th century. So Dave knew how to read and write, and he left his little sayings, his little signature on lots of his work. And I've been lucky enough to see several of his pieces at different museums across the country. They did have some of his pieces at that exhibit I told you about in Colonial Williamsburg. And I actually wanted to talk specifically about that piece. So on that piece, which is, I'm looking at my phone because I want to make sure that I read his quote correctly. It's inscribed, LM says this handle will crack. So there's a lot there, and it's just one sentence. But first of all, the fact that A, he was writing on his piece. So he wrote this into the ceramic vessel. Second, he's calling out likely his enslaver by name, Lewis Miles. So if I'm going to read it again, it says LM, Lewis Miles, says this handle will crack. So when I saw this piece, the handle had not cracked 170 years later.
Ooh.
What's so cool about this is that David Drake is being kind of sassy on his work. And that gives us a little bit of a hint into who he was, right? We know that it's important to him that he signs his work. So he takes a good amount of pride in what he is creating, and he wants people to know that it's his work. Second, he has a comfortable enough relationship with his enslaver to call him by his initials as opposed to master or something of that sort.
Right.
And then third, that he is brave enough or courageous enough to be a little bit, to push back a little bit on his enslaver in the method of his pottery. And so when I saw that, I was just delighted. But of course, that immediately had way more questions. I was like, how did he feel like he could say something like this? Was his enslaver angry in any way? But I really love that in the label for this piece at the show, it says, 170 years later, the unbroken handle bears witness to enslaved potter David Drake's skill and self-confidence.
Wow.
So I really wanted to share that because when I saw that, I was blown away. So we don't know a ton about David Drake's personal life, but we know that he made he made thousands of pieces over his lifetime. I believe around 20 of them, the ones that remain, are inscribed with his original words, and at least 50 of them have either his signature or his maker's mark or other inscriptions. Nice. So he's just a really interesting guy. But again, I think some of the things I find particularly fascinating about him are just the level of autonomy he somehow carved out for himself. And it was likely, I don't know for sure, but likely because of how amazing and how good he was at the work. So yeah, I love David Drake. I would recommend people just Google him, look him up, and if you see one of his pieces, you'll see why we all love him so much, because he really is incredibly talented.
Absolutely. I can't, I am actually jealous that you've had a chance to go around and see some of his pieces there. So now I feel like I need to get out there and see some of them myself there. But yes, he was an amazing figure. Reading about him was, it was great. It was great. Another part of the thing that I thought was really interesting about his story, or just, it was fascinating to me, because a lot of times when we're thinking about the kind of work that enslaved people did, and again, I'm a novice compared to you, of course, but the image in my mind of what an enslaved person did, the kind of work that they did, pottery is not necessarily very high on that list. So, I don't know, maybe our images or thought processes or what we've seen in television and movies or whatever, I don't know. But can you speak to maybe some of the kind of work that we don't normally think of?
Yes, I'd love to. That is one of the main things that I try to convey in my work, is the diversity of enslaved experiences. People are living all across the United States. I mean, we don't think about enslavement happening in places like the North, or even in a place like, California, where I'm from. But there are people who are enslaved in all of those places. So I want people to think about, yes, there's a diversity of experience in terms of location, but there's certainly a diversity of experience in terms of the kinds of labor that people did. So I recognize that for a lot of people, when they think about enslavement, they think about a group of enslaved people picking cotton on a southern plantation. I'm not saying that everyone thinks that, but I do think it is often the first thought that comes to people's mind. And that is not inaccurate. There were a lot of plantations, especially in Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, where there's a lot of cotton plantations and where there's a lot of enslaved people who are forced to labor there. So that is certainly some people's experience, but it's not everybody. Here in Fredericksburg, for example, there wasn't really cotton. The first kind of cash crop that existed in Virginia was tobacco, but that didn't last for a super long time. So, many people know about Chatham Manor here in Fredericksburg, it's technically in Stafford County. and that they did have tobacco fields here. But tobacco ruined the soil. Tobacco farming was very bad for the soil itself. And so by the early 19th century, that was already declining in terms of the kinds of labor that were being used. And so enslaved people did all sorts of other things, because if you really think about a society that's based on plantations and enslavement, they're using enslaved people as their servants in every way that you can imagine. So enslaved people worked as domestic labor. We know that they were chefs and cooks and servers at the table. They're cleaning homes. They're doing laundry. And I have a great story about a woman who worked as a laundress here in Fredericksburg, which I'll tell you in a minute. People were carpenters. They were blacksmiths, weavers, tanners. They made shoes. They made clothing, all sorts of different important jobs in the community. We know that people worked at the mills, processing the wheat and the corn that other enslaved laborers might have grown nearby. We know that they constructed buildings, they unloaded goods at the city docks. There's all sorts of different ways that enslaved people, labored, but also contributed to the beginning of Fredericksburg and the beginning of the United States. Right. We know a lot about one woman who was a laundress. Her name was Ellen Mitchell. She's one of my favorite stories to tell. She was enslaved at Chatham Manor by a woman named Hannah Coulter. So Hannah Coulter was in charge of the property, and then when she died, in her will, she stipulated that among the people who were enslaved on her property, they could either choose among her family members to whom to be enslaved next, or choose freedom and leave the state. Now, it's important to recognize that the reason she would have said that is because it was illegal for free Black people to stay in the state of Virginia at that time after they'd been emancipated. So it's 1859, and Coulter is trying to free the people that belonged to her after she died. Unfortunately, because she tried to give them a choice, the will was thrown out, and her property was instead taken over by a man named J. Horace Lacey, who owned the property until the Civil War, or through the Civil War. Lacey was not a good man, and there's some pretty rough stories about him. What we don't know is what kind of relationship Ellen Mitchell would have had with J. Horace Lacey. So Ellen Mitchell's enslaved on the property. She worked and lived in the laundry, which still stands. You can go see where she lived and worked right now if you go to Chatham. It's one of the only buildings that remain. So Ellen Mitchell told Lacey, let me back up. Lacey owned some plantations in Louisiana as well. So after he inherited Chatham, he decided he was going to send most of his enslaved laborers to Louisiana to work there. As I said, tobacco wasn't as strong a crop at that point. A lot of enslavers needed more labor in the deeper South. Ellen Mitchell says no. She says, I'm not going to Louisiana. She somehow convinces J. Horace Lacey to sell her to the largest slave trader in town, George Aller, who in turn allowed her to travel north to raise funds to purchase her own freedom. He tells her if she can raise $1,000, he'll free her. So she goes north for 3 months. She goes to DC, she goes to Philadelphia, she talks to different abolitionist groups. She makes more than $1,000. And on April 2nd, 1859, she and her 5 children, along with her elderly mother, were freed. And they subsequently moved to Cincinnati, Ohio, where she continued to work as a laundress. So there are some incredible stories here about the lived experiences, the lives of the people who lived and worked here. But also, one thing I try to always emphasize when I talk about enslaved people specifically is all of the different ways that they resisted their enslavement. We have David Drake, who's literally writing his name in opposition to the fact that he might be arrested if people know he can read and write. He's still writing his name anyway. Ellen Mitchell is saying, I'm not going to Louisiana, you're not taking me. And she's figuring out ways to find her own freedom. So yeah, I know that got a little off tangent, but I think Ellen Mitchell's an amazing story.
No, I think those, because they were both, what we would today consider bad, bleep. Because they really, because that was not something, they didn't have the freedom to talk the way, and to speak up for themselves that way and everything. So for them to do that is, especially in that time period, that just makes them, fascinating to me. I was like, wow.
Me too. And it makes me proud, like as a woman of color, I'm like, Black people have always been trying to figure out ways to find freedom. They've always advocated for themselves. They've
Right.
always known their own humanity and
Right.
figured out ways to advocate for their own humanity. And I think that's really beautiful.
Absolutely. Very much so. Very much so. Um, so you mentioned, Ellen, going north and to some of the larger cities and that kind of thing, but I was sort of a rabbit hole there, but I had to take an alternate route to go to another part of Virginia, and it was a very sort of a rural type of area. And in thinking about this, it made me think about the differences between the experiences of an enslaved person who lived in a more urban area, as opposed to, because it's a night and day difference even now, but as opposed to a person that was enslaved in an area that was more rural. And, I wondered a little bit about the differences then and, in their experiences.
Yeah, I think this is another thing that people don't quite know a lot about. I don't know exactly where our understanding of slavery comes from, although maybe it's just gone with the wind. But there's a lot of people who really, for them, when you think about slavery, you're just thinking about a big plantation. So there is a significant difference between the experiences of enslaved people in urban settings and rural settings. And of course, that differs by region as well. A person who's enslaved in a place like Fredericksburg might have a different experience than a place like Richmond, which would be different than a place like Charleston. There's all these different nuances to how things work in these different places.
Right.
But there are a couple of main differences I like to point out when we're thinking about urban and rural slavery. And Fredericksburg is actually a great place to think about it because Fredericksburg has both. The city of Fredericksburg, even though it was pretty small at the time, is still an urban setting. So there are enslaved people. We know of several who are working as bartenders downtown, working at restaurants, working, hiring themselves out, doing kinds of work that they wouldn't have done necessarily on a plantation. And then we also have plantations right here. We have Chatham. So we know that people are picking tobacco and, doing other crops like corn and wheat. And then at Kenmore, which is another plantation near downtown Fredericksburg, that's another entirely different experience. But some of the major things that I think are different are if you're enslaved on a plantation, you do have a built-in community. You have the people with whom you live and work, likely in quarters. Sometimes, obviously, people are employed in the houses, and they're often forced to sleep on the floor of the rooms of the people who they serve. So maybe there's a little bit of a difference in terms of community. But if you're working on a plantation, especially an isolated plantation, you have the people that you are surrounded by. So that does give you a little bit of a tighter sense of community in some cases, not all, of course. And there is a little bit more of a kind of cooperation that could happen when you're working in close quarters like that. You can help each other. You can grow crops on the side that you can share with one another. Maybe one person cooks for the whole group. There are things about living and working on a plantation that lend themselves more to creating a community. In an urban setting, that might be more difficult. We know that some women, for example, Sarah Tucker, she was the mother of John M. Washington. I'll talk about him later, but he's one of the best known enslaved men from Fredericksburg. So she actually was enslaved, but then was forced to basically take care of her own family because she lived in downtown Fredericksburg. So she figured out ways of doing labor that she could make money from so that she could care for her family. If you think about it, that's really difficult, though. She's not free. She doesn't have freedom of movement, but she still has to figure out how to take care of her family. Another thing that's difficult about urban slavery, and we think about this a lot in New Orleans, which I think is probably like the best known in terms of a kind of urban slavery experience. There's a measure of surveillance. You're walking around town and everybody knows who you are, but you need to make sure that people know that you're who you belong to, because you could be accused of trying to run away. So people have to wear passes. There are pins that some people have to wear, which you wouldn't have had to do if you're laboring on a plantation, because that's where you are. Another thing that's difficult, and it actually is difficult for both people who were in urban settings and rural settings, is creating family. So if you're enslaved on a big plantation, perhaps the person that you want to marry or the person you want to be with is nearby, and maybe it's easy, but they could be sold away at any moment. You could be sold away at any moment. So we have a lot of evidence of enslaved people who were forced to travel great distances on foot at the end of the night to go see their family members if they were enslaved on another plantation. A similar thing happens if you're enslaved and you're in an urban setting. So John in Washington, who I mentioned earlier, at some point his enslaver sold, or I think rented out, his mother to another enslaver in Orange County in Stanton. And so he was separated from his mom, by 40 miles or more. And so he was forced to stay in Fredericksburg, and he lived above he lived in the building which now holds Foodie Restaurant. He lived on the second floor.
Okay.
But he didn't, his mom is now experiencing a level of rural enslavement, whereas he's still in an urban setting. He's younger than 10 years old. So there's a lot of nuance, I think. And I think it's also really important when people are walking around a place like Fredericksburg or Richmond to understand that that is also space that was associated with enslavement. Just because we think of plantations, when we go to a plantation, we know that that is a place that was associated with enslavement. Foodie, my favorite restaurant in Fredericksburg, is also a place of enslavement. And, Beth and Joy, who co-own Foodie, are both, really aware of that history, and it means a lot to them to have their business in that space. But I just encourage people to really think about, when you're walking around town, what kinds of paths are you walking past? You're actually walking past a lot more history than you might think.
Right. Absolutely. Oh my gosh, I did not know that. So something else that I didn't know, when I was reading the book, I learned about a landscape artist named Robert Duncanson, and he, before becoming the landscape artist, he was actually one of a long line of house painters. And it looks like his grandfather learned, and then in turn taught the father, who in turn taught him. And so, but I did not realize that house painting in that era was such a lucrative business, something that really helped a lot of people, with their freedom, being able, they could pretty much write their ticket and go wherever they wanted to go there, because it looks like many of them could paint both interior and exterior there. So there was a lot of demand around there. So,
yeah, I think people don't realize how integral African-American people were to the construction and the design of homes in this era. At Kenmore, I don't know if you've been to Kenmore Plantation, but they have just really amazing, intricate architectural details. And we don't know a lot about who created all of that, but it is not outside the realm of possibility that that was an African-American artisan or an enslaved person. We don't know enough, but certainly African-Americans are deeply important to the architectural construction of the American South. The house painting, I think, is so fascinating. I love that Robert Duncanson grew up as a house painter. His family are house painters. And then Robert Duncanson was like, oh, but I want to be an artist. I think he is considered to be one of the earliest African-American artists to be known internationally. And he was a landscape artist, which, I think a lot of times, especially contemporary Black artists, they often include imagery or figures that are African American. But for him, he just wanted to paint the outside, just like the other Ohio River Valley landscape artists. And so I really loved that. And there was actually an exhibition of his work here in downtown Fredericksburg recently at a gallery downtown. But one of the things I love the most about Duncanson is I have two other local connections who also worked as house painters and pursued other things on the side. So John M. Washington, I already brought him up, but I'll give you a little bit more background on him. So he was born in 1838 here in Fredericksburg. And he, like I said, his mom's name was Sarah Tucker. She lived nearby. He was separated from her at an early age, around 1840. And he lived in Fredericksburg for most of his childhood. At one point, he was hired out to Richmond, where he worked in a tobacco factory. And then he came back to Fredericksburg and was working at the Shakespeare House at a bar in 1862 when Union troops started arriving in Fredericksburg as part of the Civil War. Okay. So the reason we know so much about John M. Washington is because he wrote a memoir of his experiences later in life. He didn't write it when he was enslaved. He wrote it in 1873 after emancipation. And it details his early life in Fredericksburg. And it's an amazing book. And I would urge anybody who lives in Fredericksburg to pick it up if they have a chance. It's only about 40 pages, the actual narrative. But he really captures the essence of what it was like to grow up enslaved here. The ways that his development and his freedom were curtailed so early on. And the story, the piece when he's separated from his mom is very, very emotionally difficult. But anyway, the reason I brought him up is so in 1862, the Union troops are coming into Fredericksburg. John M. Washington's working at the Shakespeare House. Everybody in town knows the Union troops are coming. So a lot of the white residents of Fredericksburg decide to run away. They go further out in the country. They leave the city of Fredericksburg. Most of the Black folks are like, oh, we know what's going to happen. They know that this might be their chance to become free. And so John M. Washington's enslaver comes to him and they're like, hey, the Yankees are coming. They're probably going to kill you. And he was like, okay, I'm really nervous. So let me close up the bar and then I'll meet you in the country, which is where they were going to go hide out. Instead, he locks down the bar. He makes all the other servants come in and they toast to the Yankees' health. And then he heads to the river. And he meets up with a couple of Union soldiers. And they're on the Stafford side of the river. He's on the Fredericksburg side. He's actually at Old Mill Park. So go visit where John and Washington crossed the river. He calls over to them. He's like, hey, what's up? They're like, hey, do you want to be free? And he's like, yeah. And so they come and grab him in their little boat, take him across the river, and he's freed. And, this was April 18th, 1862. And my favorite thing is it was Good Friday. So there's this incredible quote where he says, it was Good Friday indeed, the best Friday I had ever seen. Because it's free. But it's harder. So in 1862, the people who freed themselves by escaping behind Union lines aren't officially free. They're technically known as contraband because they're technically still enslaved, even if they consider themselves free. That's why the Emancipation Proclamation is such a big deal, because it officially frees all of the enslaved people in the Confederate States. Okay. Well, technically in the Confederate States. And so John M. Washington, it's 1862, it's before the Emancipation Proclamation. The Union troops eventually have to start retreating north. And John M. Washington finds out that some of his former enslavers are looking for him. He's very concerned about his personal safety. So he escapes to D.C. He leaves his wife, Annie. She's pregnant at the time. He leaves her here in Fredericksburg, and he goes to D.C. He starts over with nothing. He doesn't have any money. He doesn't have any support. After the Civil War, he and Annie are reunited. They have all their boys in D.C. Nice. To hang out with his mom again. She moves in near them, and they all live in D.C. and John M. Washington makes his living as a house painter. So
Oh.
that's how he made his living. That's how he set up his life in freedom. And they had all these boys who went on to have these amazing careers. And later, John and Washington, after he and Annie retired, they move in with their one of their sons, and I believe Massachusetts, could be Connecticut. And they just live out the rest of their life in a beautiful home near the water.
Nice.
So that's my house painter connection, is that John M. Washington made his living as a house painter. And then there's one other person I wanted to bring up who's not during the period of enslavement, but Mr. Todd. Some people might know him because he is the father of Miss Gaila Sims, who is one of our most beloved Fredericksburg figures. Mm-hmm. So Mr. Todd, early in his career, worked as a house painter, but he was a very creative person, and he, also did art on the side. And later, he would start Harambe 360, which was an experimental theater organization, an arts organization here in Fredericksburg. And he launched the Black Arts Festival. And it's actually the 50-year anniversary of the Black Arts Festival this year. And so they'll be celebrating this fall. So I think what I love about all three of those men is, they're starting as house painters, but they're using it as a way to kind of expand their worlds.
Absolutely.
Dickinson as a landscape painter, John M. Washington to raise this beautiful family, and then Mr. Todd as a way to scratch his creative itch as he's gearing up to start all these arts organizations in Fredericksburg.
Oh, that is amazing. And I think I already know what memoir I will be going out to purchase this afternoon. Because
it's really good.
That was amazing.
He's a really good writer. And I don't know, you just feel like you know him,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I love a good, a nice happy ending, I'm happy that he and his mother and Annie, whole family, they got their happy ending. I'm so happy for that.
Yeah, me too.
That's awesome. I know we talked a little bit about some of the enslaved women. I know there are a number of different professions that they had and different things that was, different skills that they had here in the area there. So I'm wondering, do you have any more stories about women there? Because it feels like we don't have as many stories about the women,
Yeah, it's a big problem, actually. In my first year at FAM, I did a lot of lectures, and I realized that there weren't a lot of women represented. And it's because a lot of times women do labor that's not as recognized. They're less available in the historical record. So it just takes a little bit of extra work. But now I do a talk that's called African American Women in Fredericksburg's History, because I want to make sure that we really highlight African American women, their labor, their lives, the specific constraints that they're working under. So in the exhibition that I just opened at the FAM, which is called Living Legacies, African American History in the Fredericksburg Area, it opened at the end of May. Black women are embedded throughout. So I'm trained as a Black feminist scholar. I learned from some amazing Black feminists in undergrad at Oberlin College. And so I'm always looking for ways to share stories of Black women. One of the people who's featured in the exhibition was enslaved at Kenmore Plantation. So there is only one photograph that we currently know about that was taken of enslaved people in Fredericksburg during the period of enslavement. So we have a watercolor of enslaved people that was created during enslavement here in this area. We have several photographs of enslaved people after the Civil War, so they would have been free at that time. As far as I know, and I could be wrong, so if people have other photos, please send them to me. But as far as I know, there's only one photograph we have, and that is of a woman named Britannia who was enslaved at Kenmore Plantation. So the George Washington Foundation has this image, and I blew it up, and it's in the exhibition. But she labored as a cook at Kenmore. And I think women, but also men who served as cooks and early culinary leaders who were also enslaved are very, unappreciated and unrecognized in American history. So we don't know a ton about Britannia, but we know a lot about other Black enslaved cooks and chefs at plantations. My friend Kelly Fanto Dietz, she's currently at Montpelier. She wrote a book called Bound to the Fire, and it's about Virginia's enslaved cooks. So one of the things she talks about is how Virginia really cultivated a reputation for hospitality. So there's all these grand plantation homes, and, they have visitors. They have the founding fathers over for dinner, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. They also have, dignitaries from England and from other places. And so Virginia's plantation owners, especially the white women who were, the mistresses of the house, cultivated this reputation of hospitality. They wanted people to come by and have comfy places to rest, and they wanted their house to look really beautiful, and they wanted to serve them extravagant meals. But if we know that this is happening during the period of enslavement, who's actually doing all of that labor?
Exactly.
All Black people, and specifically Black women. So I really hope that people don't discount the amount of labor that enslaved women had to do. Some of them were also working on plantations in the fields alongside the men. Some of them are doing other specialized jobs, like being seamstresses. We know that enslaved women were creating the clothing that both they wore and that, the people that they were enslaved to also wore. We know that they're obviously taking care of children. They're giving birth, sometimes on the field, which is truly mind-boggling to imagine. But specifically in terms of food. So enslaved cooks were valued sometimes more than other enslaved people. That's an important part that I didn't mention earlier. If you had a specialized skill or trade, sometimes that made enslaved people worth more on the market. So that's a weird thing, right? Because it's very disgusting to think of people in terms of monetary value. But as historians, we have to kind of read through that in order to understand that that meant that their labor was valued. And maybe that meant that they had a little bit more wiggle room in terms of freedom. We don't know for sure, but sometimes.
Right.
So if you go to some of the plantations here in Virginia, you can see these kitchens. Stratford Hall has a particularly impressive one that I've visited. And so you think about these people, a lot of women, some men, who are creating 10-course meals on a fire in a giant, like a giant kind of cutout stove situation. There's no refrigeration. There's not a lot of understanding of food safety. There's not a lot. Think about how difficult it would be to create a meal on a wooden fire, essentially.
Exactly.
And so whenever I go into a kitchen and I think about the enslaved people who worked there, all I can think is how hot it would have been, how intense it would have had to be. I'm bad at cooking like one meal by myself for me, much less for, the president or whatever. But also, I think about this a lot. You know that what you're making is going to be fed to the people who enslaved you and also their friends. So think about the amount of pressure and fear that would have been involved in that. If you give somebody something that makes them sick, they might say you poisoned them. That might be the end of you. You know what I mean? And so, I think there's value in thinking about all sorts of aspects of the history of enslavement. But for me, thinking about Black women's labor, the things that they were able to do, the particular issues that they had, we know that they were often subject to sexual assault, which is on a daily basis. And yet they were strong enough to continue continue the legacy of Blackness in America and create some amazing things. So, I would recommend that book if people are interested in learning more about enslaved cooks. It's called Bound to the Fire by Kelly Fanto Dietz.
Absolutely. You're going to have me buying all kinds of things. I did want to also mention that because I know, you touched on it really quickly, the Living Legacies exhibition there. But for anybody that's watching, I want to make sure that they know what an amazing, amazing exhibition it is. It, oh my gosh, was just taking it all in. It was, I learned a lot. It is really worth carving out the time and going in and taking it in. So I want everybody to know that and not to miss it there. It lasts for a year. Is that correct?
It's actually up for 3 years. Yeah. So
Okay.
where it is like the big signature exhibition space in FAM. So it'll be up for 3 years. And thank you. I poured a lot into that exhibit, and I'm very proud of it. And I'm very proud that Black women are visible throughout it. So in every section, you learn about general Black women's history and then specific Black women's stories. And I'm very proud of that.
Yes, it was amazing. There definitely everybody needs to get by there and see it. It's awesome. So as a museum curator, do you find it difficult, and sort of like segueing into the next part, do you find it difficult to locate objects that reflect the time of enslavement, and when you're trying to create an exhibition there, how difficult is it to find the artifacts that you would like to include?
It's very hard, honestly, because objects associated with African Americans were not always prioritized for saving and preserving by museums in the past. That's one reason. The second reason is African Americans were treated as objects themselves. So anything that they had didn't technically belong to them during the period of enslavement. So it's not like these things are easily passed from person to person. They certainly did pass things on from person to person, but it wasn't an easy thing to do, especially if you could be sold south at any moment. You're not allowed to go back to your quarters and find the things that you want to take with you. So those two reasons make it very difficult to find these objects. So, some of the big museums, like the National Museum of African American History and Culture in DC, the new International African American Museum in Charleston, South Carolina, they did amazing work to find objects. But for a small museum like FAM, we just don't have the time or the resources to do a huge scale call for objects. And so the way that I work is, I get to know community members, I get to know people, and I get to go eventually to their homes sometimes, and I get to see what kinds of objects that they have, and I talk to them about whether or not they're willing to share those objects with the museum. But even still, which, I have a lot of amazing contacts in this community, and I've been very grateful for the kind of support they've given me. It's still hard to find objects related to enslavement. And so you have to improvise. You have to be very flexible, and you have to understand that you're not necessarily going to find exactly what you're looking for. And so in the Living Legacies exhibition, there's a lot of images, a lot of reproductions, and because it's very important to me to show people's faces as much as possible. Right. I think, especially when we're talking about history, sometimes people think it's so abstract. It's like, oh, those people, they're not people like I'm a person, But it's like, no, they're right. Just like us. I mean, we have phones, but they, they have all of the same hopes and dreams and worries and fears and capacity for pain that we do. Right. And so I like to show people's faces as much as possible. The actual objects, we came up with a couple of different techniques with Living Legacies. One of them was that we put on display a bunch of documentation related to enslavement. So while objects themselves have not always lasted or made it through the years, thanks to a lot of archives, we do have access to the paperwork that was associated with enslaved people. Okay. In that exhibition, we have some free papers for the De Baptiste kids. The De Baptiste was one of the most prominent free Black families in Fredericksburg in the late 18th, early 19th century. So we had free papers for two of the De Baptiste sons that were signed by their mother, Frances. We also have a document that is a bill of sale for a girl named Kate, who was 16 years old and was sold for, I think, 20 pounds. This was before US money, still during the period of, I think it was just after the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
So I use those objects, which are not visually that exciting, to try to get people to understand a little bit more about the lived experience of enslavement. And then I believe that we're going to talk a little bit more about it, but we have some objects from Ferry Farm that were dug up through an archaeological dig.
Okay, gotcha. So, so throwing over to Ferry Farm, and you know, I know that in some of the things that I was reading, there were ladies there who there was like the ceramics, for instance, and everything. If the ceramic, if it was broken, these ladies they had to have a level of skill to know what it was made of, what the glue was like, so that they could repair it, you know, to the standard of the, you know, wealthy high society women that they were working for there. So it was, you know, so there were some, you know, things there. Of course, hair workers. I know that there was a story where the women were coming across the river to get their wigs cleaned and dressed and all of the things, whatever. So, you know, all of those things were happening. And I think that this was, you know, sort of Mary Washington's, you know, maybe that was her thing. You know, that was important to her, you know. So, you know, can you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think so. You know, I wanted to say that it's very difficult to find objects, but what is so cool is when you can find some cool objects. And so at Ferry Farm, which is George Washington's childhood home, which would have been, you know, partially owned by Mary Washington before she moved to the Mary Washington House here in downtown Fredericksburg, they conducted some archaeological digs around the quarters where enslaved people lived at Ferry Farm. And so they found a lot of amazing objects. They're small little pieces. They're not, you know, the big, amazing things that you might be looking for. But a couple of those objects are now on display at the museum. So that includes some ceramics that were glued back together. So we do know that enslaved people were not only responsible for creating some of these ceramics, they also had to repair them. And these ceramics are not for show all the time. Some of them might have been, but these are things that people need to use. You know, they can't go to Target to pick up a new plate every time they break one like I do. And so they needed to be able to repair some of these objects. So they basically invented new forms of glue so that they can put these objects together. We do have a couple of wig curlers on display. I think, like the chefs, there's such an intimacy to the relationship between enslaved people and their enslavers. I think that is very strange and honestly kind of like gives me the creeps because it's like you're making these people do your hair. That's a very intimate relationship, but you don't see them as people.
Yeah, it's a very odd dynamic, and especially because in this day, we love our hairdressers.
Yes.
You know, they are extended therapy for us or whatever. They're our friends. So the idea that, you know, they have this sort of weird dynamic there where where that separation is there is odd to wrap your mind around that thought process and concept because it is so different from.
Yep. I agree. I think it's worth thinking about that relationship. And then the last thing that we have, and something that I find just so special, is hairpins. So these hairpins were found in the quarters. So we have a direct connection to enslaved women who likely, just like I did before I got on this call, put some pins in my hair. They were putting pins in their hair. So That is one of the most special things about being a curator, is being so close to these physical objects and that connection to the past. You know, I could never know what they felt like, what it was like. I give them all, you know, I honor them, I respect them, I care about them. So seeing an object, sometimes holding it in my hand, you know, with gloves, is really special to me. And so if you go to FAM and you go see Living Legacies, you'll see a case that has these little tiny things, and you might be like, what is that? That looks like trash. And it, you know, I guess technically it was trash because it was discarded, but it's not just trash. It's these amazing connections to the past.
Absolutely. Oh, wow. Now I'm going to have to go back and
Sorry.
No, not at all. There's so much great things there that I definitely want to go back and spend more time with it there, because it's just that well done. It really is.
Thank you.
So I wanted to kind of go back when we were talking about Robert Duncanson and his, you know, his moving into art and that kind of, because I love art. And I recently read this quote there, so I'm going to just read it here. And it says, modern art often carries echoes of the past, adopting elements from previous art movements to forge new paths. And I actually had to sit with that for a minute and really think about the fact that a lot of our modern artists today, they're kind of leaning on some of those innovations, you know, that even went back to slavery times. And so what's your take on that?
No, I think that's 100% true. And actually, so like I said, my sister works at museums as well. She's a museum curator. We do almost the exact same work, but she's an art historian and I'm a just regular historian. And so our work is very intertwined because some of the people that she works with or whose work that she displays at her museum are inspired by some of the work that I have learned about and read as I've done history. So there's a bunch of contemporary Black artists that I think are doing exactly what you say. They are conjuring the past in different and innovative ways. I could literally talk about them forever, but I wanted to bring up a couple because they have a direct connection to the history of African American craftspeople. Okay. So the first is Faith Ringgold. So she passed just a few years ago. She's one of my favorite artists, and she's a multimedia artist. She did all sorts of mediums, but one of the things that she got most famous for were her story quilts. So we know that enslaved and free African-American women made quilts, and a lot of those have been passed down. And the quilts of Gee's Bend, which is a community in Alabama, are very famous now as contemporary art objects. Mm-hmm. And so I do think it's very special that Faith Ringgold was working in the medium of quilts. But what she did was she's creating these quilts, but she's telling stories through them. Her most famous one is called Tar Beach. It's about the family gatherings that she had on her rooftop as a kid growing up in New York. And that one was actually turned into a children's book called Tar Beach. And so I think it's really beautiful when people call to the past, but innovate it and make it in new ways. So African-American women during the enslavement period weren't necessarily making story quilts. Some of them might have been, but Faith Ringgold's taking that kind of technique that was created during enslavement and bringing it into the present. And so that I really love. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Oh, no, I just said very nice. Yes.
Yeah, she's amazing. And then another Black woman who's doing something similar is Simone Lee. So Simone Lee is a contemporary artist. She's actually from Chicago. And I think it's really interesting because the three artists that I wanted to bring up were all based or brought up in the North. But they're recalling a lot of the crafts that were created in the South. And I think that is likely because of the Great Migration. So we know that a lot of African-American people in the early 20th century, families left the South, most likely because of Jim Crow, racial violence, segregation, and then went north. Some of them even went to California, like my family did. But so Simone Lee grew up in Chicago, but her work, she's a sculptor. And so her work really calls back to David Drake in many ways, but they're huge. They're these giant, large-scale ceramic pieces. And some of them, I just saw an exhibition of hers in DC. I guess it wasn't just, I think I saw it last year. But she creates, there's a couple of pieces that are like women, but their skirts look like the vessels that David Drake made.
Oh, wow.
But they're huge, and they're just exquisite and just so beautiful.
Nice.
And then the last one I wanted to bring up is Theaster Gates. So Theaster Gates is actually an acquaintance of mine. I got to meet him and hang out with him once, and his family's from the South, and he's actually Theaster Gates Jr., I think. So his family actually owns land in the South. I don't remember where, but he is mostly based in Chicago, and that's where he grew up. So he also recreates or makes new versions of ceramic pots and jugs that recall David Drake and the other potters of Edgefield. And so, but he's a very abstract artist. So if you go see his work, he has an installation at the Virginia Museum of Fine Arts right now, I think. You'll see it's a lot more abstract, so it does make you think a little bit more. But what I love about his stuff is you can kind of come away with whatever interpretation you want. Right. What is he recalling? Who is he thinking of? And one of the coolest things about Theaster Gates is he likes to repurpose older material. And so this isn't a sculpture piece, but he has this amazing piece at the National Gallery. No, it's not at the National Gallery. It's at the American Art Museum at Smithsonian. That is wood from a basketball court in Chicago. The building was kind of taken down, and he took the wood and created this new piece. And so I think that also recalls these enslaved craftspeople who are working with very little materials. They have to innovate and create new things out of very little. And that is part of his practice as a contemporary artist.
Yeah. Truly the old becoming new.
Exactly.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Nice. Very nice. Awesome. Well, I have learned a lot. I've got on my TBR and to be purchased. At this point, I tell you, this was amazing. Dr. Gaila Sims, thank you so very much.
Thank you. And I just want to let you know, Ingrid, that I'm currently working on a book. So at some point, you're going to have to add that to your TBR as well. I'll let you know.
Absolutely. And we'll have to have you back again.
Oh, please.
Absolutely. It has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Have a great day.
All right. You as well.